Okay, what we'll do is I'll just run through some housekeepings while we wait for a few more people to join. We're going to have a small and beautiful group today to have a great conversation. If you do want to put your camera on, that's fine. If you don't want to put your camera on, that's also fine. Really, these are designed for as much participation as you feel comfortable with. What we're going to do is with our conversations, it's really, we have some ideas of what we'd like to talk about in the chapter, and to give you an idea of where these reading groups came from is that IZE members really wanted more detail, more kind of conversation about the different chapters and about some of the key themes in them. So today is all about chapter 3, which is about promoting conservation education for all. We've got a couple of the IZE board members. So there's myself, I'm based at Auckland Zoo. I am the Oceania regional rep and also newly appointed president-elect, which I'm very delightful about. And then we also have Valerie. Valerie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Valerie, and I am the representative for Latin America. I work at La Aurora Zoo in Guatemala City, which is in Central America. I don't know, I don't look like it, but I'm Latina for sure. So hi to everybody.
Thanks, Valerie. We were due to have a couple of other board members with us, but for technical and kind of meeting clashes, you have myself and Valerie today. So as I said, it's about chapter 3. For me, it is, chapter 1 is all about setting the scene, about the culture, about making that education plan. Chapter 2 was really thinking about the purpose, about why we wanted to do the things we do in conservation education. And chapter 3 then moves, for me, there's 2 parts. The first one is about reach and like where we are connecting with our communities. And the second part is like who. So who are our audiences and how do we connect with as many people and from as diverse backgrounds and communities as possible. Oh, I should say, before we get on to the main chat, by staying and participating, you are agreeing to be recorded. You see that we've got the recording on, and they will be popped onto our IZE YouTube channel so you can watch them later. So hello to anybody who's watching later on. So to get us going, I'm going to start with the kind of first part, which talks about furthering the reach of zoos and aquariums. And I was rereading the chapter, and it's very interesting how I think 2 years, lots have changed, but also not much has changed. And there's a section right at the end of the chapter which talks about the potential of online conservation education, because if you remember, it was written at the start of 2020 and then was edited through 2020 and then launched in October. So that was just at the start of maybe our first lockdowns, first pandemics. And I feel that there's quite a large portion that could be updated quite a lot, because in the last 2 years, I feel that we've learned a lot about reaching audiences when our zoos are closed, which for many of us at the time of the writing of this strategy wasn't even in our mind. So Valerie, if we think about the last 2 years and maybe think about those online conservation education experiences, talk to us about what kind of things you've learnt from those opportunities.
I think that we're very, especially education professionals, we're very social, we're very sociable. And I think that pre-COVID, we're very used to thinking of all our activities and programs being done like face-to-face, right? Like in real time. And this forced us to look for new tools and also to adapt and learn new things in order to be able to communicate with all our audiences, right? And I think that just the fact that we had to go online helped us reach more audiences than we were able to before, right? I think that it made us sort of widen our visuals and our context as well, as to how many people we're not reaching before, and that we were able to reach with our online presence and activities as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to think about, you know, the construct of zoos, and many zoos for a long time, zoos and aquariums, kind of were on the zoo site, kind of waiting for people to come to them. And we had people who visit us, and we have people who don't visit us. And that, you know, when I started in zoos, those were the conversations, like, why do people not visit zoos? Whereas now that we know that the visit to the physical side of the zoo is only one part of our kind of a remit. Our, you know, through conservation education, that is in lots of different spaces and places, whether that's online, out in the community, on our field sites, through our social media, on our websites. And so it's really interesting to think, yes, we do have physical sites, which absolutely are the jewel in our kind of, you know, our organizations. But for me, certainly in the last 5 years, we've really, as you say, widened that kind of lens to say there's lots more out there. And so thinking about, you know, moving to like out in the community side, Valerie, it's always, you know, thinking about diverse communities and thinking about the communities that connect to your zoo. Like, how on earth do you go about kind of knowing who's out there and then making relevant and authentic connections? Talk us through some of the things that you've been up to.
Well, I'm not going to lie to you. We've always had that issue present, that we're not covering and we're not being inclusive enough. And given that we're in Latin America, especially in Central America, we don't have as many means as many other zoos around the world either, right? So we might want to be able to cover everything, but we might not be able to do so, right? And I'm going to be very honest with you. We've been improving a lot of our installations, facilities, and our programs, like after COVID, or even as we're building new experiences, but we haven't actually considered how to adapt the older ones that we have, right? And as I was telling you before, we've been doing a series of talks or webinars in Latin America about each of the chapters. And a very interesting idea came up of what to do in order to actually involve or be more inclusive with the things that you already have, if you can't invest in newer things, right? And so what we saw is that there's this very cool program in one of the zoos where they created different sort of like tours that you can take, and they've mapped different locations in the zoo that might be qualified for different types of situations, right? So they said, so maybe my whole zoo or my whole aquarium is not equipped or designed for all types of disabilities, right? Or is not inclusive enough, but there are certain areas and certain activities that are, right? So I'm going to map those out, and I'm going to communicate that so that people know that there are many things that I can offer that are already available, right? So sometimes we assume, right? But as they say, I'm not going to swear because this is being recorded, but you know what they say, assumption is the mother of all, and you know the rest, right? And so, so basically, just by being able to communicate it and sort of just letting it out and say, hey, you know, these are some of the things that I have available that you might enjoy, right, is a lot, because sometimes we just assume that people know, but they don't, right? So even if you don't have all the means in order to improve or be as inclusive as you would like to be, there are always some things that you can do about it with the things that you have at your disposition. So I thought that was very nice, because that's something that everyone in every context can apply, right? Even if you have or you don't have enough resources, or even if you're in different contexts, right, in different countries, that's something that you can actually apply everywhere. So I like that idea.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, a key point about assumptions. You know, a common and naive assumption was like, why wouldn't people want to come to the zoo? Why, you know, why are these people not visiting us on a regular basis? And you know, it is the idea that we're assuming our own assumption, you know, like we're saying, well, they must be like us. And it's a really big thing in zoos and aquariums, a big conversation about how do you bring people to the table, to your zoo and aquarium from the community, to find out what the role of the zoo and aquarium is in their community, not the other way around. And so thinking about, I like the idea of looking at a zoo and saying, what is it we can connect different parts of our community to? A piece of research I remember from the Natural History Museum, they were trying to get different members of communities in London to visit the museum. And the researcher said she had a moment where a lady was like, there's just nothing here for me. And it wasn't about that she didn't know, that they were like, oh, we can get you to the museum, we can help you kind of get transport, we can give you free access. And it just wasn't for them. And so even the assumption that biodiversity conservation is for people, or how can we think about the relevancy and how can we make it localized and personalized? And there's a lot in the chapter thinking about that approach, saying we've got to understand where our communities are at, or even what's relevant or kind of particular kind of hook for them, to be able to connect with them in the right way. A couple of examples, I remember I used to work at London Zoo, and we worked with a community from the Chagos archipelago when we were talking about having a community day, and they were very excited because the thing that they wanted to do, we want to talk about kind of, marine conservation in the Chagos archipelago, but actually they wanted to have a community day, a family day. And they said that is the most important thing for us, to see people that we haven't seen for a long time, to share food, to share stories. And yes, of course, we'll have conversations about marine conservation. But when we think about where the zoo or conservation is on the list of priorities in people's lives, especially, in the last couple of years, there are other things, more pressing things, that are often in that kind of immediate sphere. The other example I always think about myself, I'm not a big football fan. You might, I don't know, you might or might not guess, but I'm a big music fan. And so, if you think about, there's a football ground called Old Trafford in Manchester. I would never go to a football match, but I did go and visit it because Bruce Springsteen was playing there. So I ended up kind of connecting with a football ground for a completely different reason. Now, I'm not saying that you put on Bruce Springsteen in your zoo, but if we think about different ways that we are connecting with our communities, and this is where we need to have good conversations. We need to have kind of a moment or several moments to listen to our communities about where they feel the zoo and aquarium, what's the role that the zoo and aquarium can play in their lives. And it may be connected to conservation, but it may be connected to other social kind of well-being outcomes to really help those different kind of communities out. So we'll take a moment. Oh, sorry, Valerie, over to you.
Yeah, no, I was just going to give one more example. In my zoo in particular, we never had like an issue of attracting an audience with less resources, right? We were always very thoughtful of that. We have like a special entrance fee, if needed, or for like public schools or etc., or for NGOs or foundations and church groups that do all these really cool stuff for kids. But the zoo in Guatemala was always perceived to be an activity that people went when they were like lower middle class or lower class, right? And so we were like missing out on like upper middle and upper class because they didn't perceive a zoo visit, right? Like, I don't know, that was appealing to them. And so we had to come up with different activities and services that were like VIP, right? So that they would be more enticed or they would be more attracted to come to the zoo. And they were all educated, they were all educational and related to conservation activities, right? They were just activities that were offered as a VIP package, but they were always related to conservation education. So that did work out. So sometimes we're used to just thinking, as we said before, of our demographics or the ones that we know about. But we need to, as you said, know more about the community where we live, the city where we live, and how that's actually composed, like what the demographic looks like for that location where our zoo or aquarium is located. because we might be
Yeah,
missing some.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And at Auckland Zoo, we work closely with our marketing and communication teams to do exactly that. So we're thinking about what do we know about the audiences that come, but also what are all the new audiences that we want to develop. And you're right about, thinking about who is a zoo for. An example from our marketing team was that they had some feedback about the photos on their marketing and promotion. And a couple of, like, do you have to dress up when you go to the zoo? Because of course, if you say, oh, can you come and be part of our photos for the zoo? People put on the best sweater and do the hair. And that was a feedback saying, I don't have any of those clothes. I don't look like those people. So is the zoo not for me? And I think that's an important notion of really thinking about how we can work with different departments in our zoos and aquariums to really uncover what we know and what we don't know about our audiences, what we know, what we don't know about who is in our communities. I mean, where I live in Auckland, it's one of the most multicultural cities in the world. And, a piece of work that we are just starting on, saying, what do we know? But also, where are the gaps of our knowledge? And then thinking, how on earth are we going to find out? It's the idea, you know what you don't know, but it's not a quick fix. It's a long process to really embed ourselves within our community so we can start making those better connections. So we'll take a moment now to kind of go to the audience. Any comments, any questions, any kind of examples that any of you would like to share at this time?
I know you can do it. My English is a second language, and I'm here talking to you, so I want to hear about you.
And it's absolutely fine if you don't, because we always say that participation is as much as you want to do. But have a think about some questions for us. If there's anything you would like to ask us, pop it in the chat. We'll be here for the next kind of 40 minutes. So moving on from communities, and I think it is a thread for this chapter, to really challenge zoos and aquariums to go beyond what the traditions were about where we deliver conservation education. Even in the 20 years I've been involved in conservation education, it always was in a zoo classroom. And we didn't do a lot out in the zoo, and then suddenly it's like, well, let's take our learning and teaching out into the zoo. And then it's sort of thinking, well, where else can we kind of connect, whether it's online, out in the community, in our field? And that's where I think that the beauty of our industry, of our profession, is that we're always evolving. It is a tricky thing because it's an ever-moving target, because we are trying to adapt to our audience's needs. I'm not sure if we've got any conservation education on TikTok yet, but thinking about what kind of media our audiences use, and are we going to show up where our communities are, and how do we make it that relevant, that authentic, that personalized and localized, because that's, to me, a really key part on how we can drive those conservation and social outcomes. The other side of the chapter talks about diversity, equity, access and inclusion, and that really is connected to some of the things we've talked about already. But yeah. Valerie, let's talk about your thoughts on how on earth do you go about thinking about those big complex topics around diversity and equity, access and inclusion, and how are you thinking about that where you work at the moment?
Well, basically, I think that we have a similar issue in New Zealand and Guatemala, is that we have a lot of local ethnic groups, right? And they all speak different languages, and not only that, but because that's just like easier to target. If it were just a language barrier, then that would be easier, right? But it's also like not just a cultural barrier as well, but mostly how they perceive things in their natural environment, right? And so sometimes, in order to make that translation and to get to different audiences, you need to sort of remodel or rethink a lot of the exhibits that you have in your zoo and aquarium, and some activities that go along with that. And so before, I don't know, maybe we're like way behind you guys. Maybe you already do this, right? But before, we didn't quite mix like all the natural resources with the cultural resources at the zoo. We're basically just thinking about conservation education, right? And ever since, well, this strategy that came out, and it's called social change for a reason, right? Because it's all about behavior change in human beings, right? It's a social issue. And so we started thinking about that, and we said, I think it's time that we start rethinking most of our activities and some of the designs that we do in our exhibits in order to mix both cultural, like riches with natural riches as well. And because sometimes, and I'm pretty sure that happens in all of your countries, the way that you perceive nature itself from your window or from where you live is a complete different reality from what other people live it inside, like within your country as well, right? It looks different. You live it different. And so we're starting to incorporate those themes and issues to our exhibits and to our activities as well, like just trying to mix into things the whole like cultural, just like the richness of the country's cultural heritage as well, right? And so and I think that that's something that we've never thought of before, and that will certainly expand our inclusiveness, right? And so yeah, that's something that we're working on at the moment. What are you guys doing at your zoo?
Thanks, Valerie. And I think the point about this, or you were all doing it already, and I think actually we're all at different stages of our journey when we think about the inclusion side, and it's interesting to hear your thoughts around how do we weave that cultural dimension into the kind of education and the social side. And I do think it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, because you need to understand who are your communities and who are the people that are visiting, to be able to understand, well, what kind of representation, what kind of voices that you want to put in your exhibits, in your kind of programs. I mean, where I am in New Zealand, we are a multicultural city in Auckland, but we're also a bicultural country. And so, for me coming in sort of 3 years ago, very little understanding of the Indigenous culture of Māori and how we can think about weaving that Indigenous thought, that worldview, into what we're doing at the zoo has been a brilliant journey for me, a really interesting kind of movement for the zoo to really think about when we want to kind of strengthen our relationship with the Māori worldview, what does that mean? And that, for us, it's gone from that we have two language, like bilingual signage. We have Indigenous thought and language woven into our conservation learning programs. We're even thinking about the ways that we recruit and what our adverts look like and what kind of language we are using. And so really we're talking about conservation education, but a lot of these themes are kind of panning across the organization. And so that's where I feel that how do we work with our colleagues in different departments and different places to be able to have a think about what kind of culture, how do we get that into our kind of conversations or narratives in the right way? Because there's always that kind of that intention that we want to do it, but making sure like what is the impact that we are creating in that space.
Yeah. Or sometimes it happens that you see like an exhibit and it's wonderful, right? Maybe it's like an African exhibit. And they've done this. They have this like ranger cabin and how it looks on the inside, and then it's perfect, and you get a grasp of all the of that area and the cultural part of that area. but then maybe you have an autochthonous species and you don't do that for the species that's local, right? And that's something that you should consider as well.
Yeah, and that goes back to the chapter 2,
Yeah.
saying what is the purpose of what you're doing. And so it's, you know, it's not saying that all exhibits need to follow this one direction, because it depends what kind of outcomes that you're getting to. And so when we're thinking about inclusive, you're absolutely right. It's really taking a big look at our spaces and places and our programs. For me, you know, if we think about the equity side of the conversation, it used to be, you know, oh, it's all about equality. Equality matters, and we need to give everybody the same thing. Whereas now the conversation has evolved quite rightly onto equitable opportunities. And the word equity is more around identifying what individuals or groups of people actually need, and that will be different for different parts of our communities. But importantly, if you're giving a group more resources, more opportunities, more kind of support, it's not taking anything away from anybody else. It means that you are able to support different parts of our community to thrive by giving them the support, the opportunities they need to be able to access your programs or your site. And so for me, thinking about equity is really important for conservation education. And that again is quite a wide-ranging topic. So thinking about even the, you know, what kind of topics do you have in your sessions? What kind of language are you using? You know, what kind of conversations, what kind of, do you understand the different kinds of learners? And are you, you know, again, if we think about the traditions of even teaching and learning, it used to be probably a chalkboard when I was at school. You know, it was somebody who talked at you for an hour. Whereas now that we know that we need to think about different ways, and we'll talk about that in chapter 4, those approaches and methods that really connect to the different needs of our audiences, and making sure that we understand that in the right way. So thinking about some of the programs that you run, Valerie, are there any examples of where you have thought about the doing different things with different communities or different groups?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, for example, we have this like volunteering group, right? And we get anywhere from 16 and up, right? But we make when we advertise the volunteering program, we want to make sure that that older citizens come to our program as well. Like, we love them, right? We cherish them, and we really want them to come. And so we do make a differentiation, right, for them, because obviously the volunteering program is not going to look exactly the same for all age groups, right? And so we know that most of the older citizens want to come because they want company, and they like talking to people, and they like they want to feel like they're still very relevant and that they can help. You know, that's very important to them. And so we give them like special tasks, right, that we wouldn't to other people, so that they feel like they are very much needed, and that we value their expertise, and that we know that they're better actually talking to people. And so we do differentiate some of the tasks, and some of and during the workshops as well, we do some differentiation as well for those different age groups, right? Because we actually want them to come. And so, yeah, that's one of the examples that we have. And then while I think of another one, maybe you want to share one too, Sarah.
Sure. I actually remember, it wasn't in this chapter, a great example from Talent Zoo, Daja, was all your hobby clubs. You've got loads of different hobby clubs for all sorts of different kinds of people in different groups. And I really thought that, I mean, it sounded like a lot of work, but really acknowledging the different interests and the different kind of ways that you can connect with different communities was incredible to say, actually, you know, people have different interests and hobbies, and how then can we use a zoo as a platform to demonstrate those interests. So have a look at the case study in the strategy. because I really like that one. For us at Auckland Zoo, I mean, we have a lot of older volunteers, and one of the things that we're trying to do is the other way, is how to think about how to get younger volunteers in. And we've got a summer program with being connected with a university and saying, you know, how is volunteering relevant to younger people? And, you know, thinking about our demographic at the moment, it is more of that kind of senior level. And so the team have been thinking about, well, is it where we're advertising? Is it the length of service, the commitment? Is it the length of training? What are the things that may be a barrier? And how can we think about those? But also, how can we think about the benefits for younger audiences? So one of the students said that volunteering to them was that service, but also can be part of their university credits. So we've been thinking about ways that we can support student volunteering, which is just over the summer period, so not a longer commitment, but also tying into that academic and kind of personal progression that a lot of the students in Auckland need. And so I think you're right. It's thinking about what are the ways that will fit into that community. It goes back to having, conversations with them, whether you go into like co-designing programs, it goes back to those listening and, not thinking, right, okay, we're going to have this program for this community. And from an internal perspective, and not acknowledging the thoughts and feelings and where that community is at and how they feel. So we'll take a moment to see if we've got any comments, any questions from our audience.
Something that you've been having trouble with, and maybe all of us together can help you come up with a solution, or?
Oh, Laura. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's something that we could come up with a solution with. It's a bigger issue to deal with. This is the classic case of go to a conference in a slightly different field and get your mind expanded, and then you have big problems. But one of the things that's been kind of on my mind the last 6 months or so is, looking at how there's a lot of work going on at decolonizing different areas of education, and especially in Europe, for sure. All the zoos really, they are very colonial spaces, like inherently they're quite colonial. So, to try and think about, how can we do that, which I think is something that needs to be happening. It's not just an education issue, but I do feel also that maybe, education is a good place to start sort of unpicking some of that, because obviously we do have these opportunities to kind of reach a more diverse range of audiences. It's one of those tricky things where I kind of, same thing when it comes to looking at, diversity and equity and inclusion more broadly, that, we're kind of, certainly in Europe, we are not a diverse group of people, definitely not ethnically diverse, not particularly socioeconomically diverse. So sometimes I feel like, well, as a white person from a middle class background, I'm not the person who should be championing this, but also if there's no one else to step up who's better placed to do that work, then, how do we start with kind of unpicking that knot? So yeah, big challenge, especially for those of you who are quite late on a Wednesday evening like I am. It's not something that is an easy fix, but just, something that's on my mind and something that I think needs to be maybe incorporated a bit more into, our education thinking.
Thanks, Laura. Great questions, as always. One of the things that I heard was around, like, who is working in zoos and aquariums, who are our people, and you were talking about Europe not being as diverse or representative of the communities, and I think that is common around the world. I do think there's a bit of a turn going on, happily, but it's taking its time. And so I said I've been here for, working in zoos for 20 years, and there was a way to look. There was even like a gender bias. There was assumptions about kind of, if you're a woman working, then of course you go off and have children. If you have blue hair, facial piercings, tattoos, then why is there a place for you to work here looking like that? And at a recent conference, I was at the AZA conference in Baltimore, and people were talking about they're changing their dress code policy. They're changing that you can have visible tattoos and piercings. They're changing their idea of recruitment and having training on unconscious bias, and really calling out the colonial practices that have been created and perpetuated in the organizations. And there was some great conversations about, we are very uncomfortable. We're comfortable at being uncomfortable. And that's where I think a lot of the conversations need to start. And, you know, that's what I love about the zoo and aquarium community, that if there's a conversation in Europe happening, there's probably one happening in a different region as well. And so, you know, that's where I think that they are big questions, but they are necessary questions to start foregrounding. And certainly in the American conferences, lots of sessions about diversity, equity, access, inclusion, but also really calling out what are the kind of, how do we go about, what are the conversations that we can have to start decolonizing our zoos and aquariums.
Yeah, okay, so we need to pay more attention to WZACES, because I feel like we're definitely a few steps behind sort of on the European level. People are still like, oh, let's talk about gender diversity or, you know, gender bias. You know, we're still kind of at that stage. I don't think we've quite moved on to a more expansive, not a regional level anyway. I'm sure we have individual zoos blazing a trail, but I think it's not quite there
in Europe. We have, you know, what is it, 50 countries, different languages. The IAZA is naturally a diverse cultural membership association, and so that does it naturally. There are some issues. I loved the keynote at this year's IAZA conference, which you can see on the IAZA Facebook channel. I don't know if it's on YouTube. And it was a lady talking about cultural biases and cultural differences. And her talk was about, how do we say, like, what noise does a rooster make? And she was giving demonstrations about every different culture will say a different noise that a rooster makes. And then she gave some great examples about, hey, well, here we have a British person who thinks this way and has this way of talking on an email, and they're trying to communicate with a French person or somebody from Hungary, I think the example was. And there were, you know, cultural kind of misses in basic communication, and that led to a lot of kind of tension. And so she was trying to call out, saying, you know, acknowledge the multicultural organization you're in, but also know that some of the things that are coming up, some of the issues, are actually down to being kind of in your own culture, and not being saying, actually, when you move into, let's say, the IAZA space, you have to kind of acknowledge that people think, feel, and act very differently because of their culture, because of their background. So if you haven't seen it, I would recommend that as a great keynote to have a listen to, about those cultural pillars and about those kind of things that we need to do to cross boundaries and to think about how we can be a bit more inclusive. Thanks, Laura. And Valerie, anything to add to that conversation?
Yeah, I had to look it up. I had to look the term up online while you guys were talking, because that's not a terminology that is very used in this area of the world. But and I was going to ask you,
what was
decolonizing? The education program. Yeah, I was like, let me, you know, look it up just to get a grasp and context on this thing. But I was going to ask Laura, where are you from? Laura.
Yeah, sorry, just finding my unmute button. Yeah, I'm from the UK originally, so I started out volunteering and working in zoos over there, and now I work in Amsterdam for the European Zoo Association.
Oh,
so
okay.
I'm in the Netherlands now, so two like very big colonial countries. So yeah, it maybe comes up a little bit more in conversation.
So you think of it more in terms of like all the people that have immigrated to all these countries and now are part of its cultural richness, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit about, yeah, definitely in Amsterdam, because, you know, although I'm not working in the zoo here, our office is on the grounds, and the fact that, you know, the faces I see visiting the zoo are not
Mhm.
fully reflective of, you know, the diversity of people that you see just walking around on the street in the local area. So there's obviously some communities, cultural backgrounds, ethnicities that are not involved with the zoo for, you know, whatever reason that might be, and we probably haven't done the work to be sure of what the reason is that they're not engaging. But yeah, also I think just this idea about the fact that because there are a lot of countries in Europe that have this kind of colonial history, so it's also, you know,
Mhm.
how to kind of engage with that, and kind of thinking about, you know, how zoos would originally function, where you're effectively going to some faraway country, getting a load of animals, putting them on a ship, bringing them back, and, you know, displaying them like, look at these strange and weird and wonderful things from distant lands. So although obviously, you know, the way that we present ourselves as zoos has evolved a lot, I think you know, that kind of still, that sort of history is still there, and, you know, maybe that part of what is
Yeah,
alienating or sort of disengaging certain
yeah,
communities that, you know, we could be reaching out to. So I think
yeah.
that's
I
kind of, you
think
know,
that,
how I'm thinking of it. There's many other ways that people could be developing that thought, I'm sure.
yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think that has a lot to do with what Sarah was saying before, that you need to work with like different departments in your zoo, including the marketing. And so you need to find out, as you said, maybe it's something related to not having done the research yet on what are their interests, or what would bring them to the zoo, or what's lacking, what do I need to offer that I'm not offering yet. And I think that it's very feasible. I think one of the reasons why I love zoos and aquariums is because I think they are a great vehicle for education. When you do social development programs, especially around the world in poorer areas, right? One of the components that always fails is the education component, because you're forcing people to do something that they don't exactly want to do, or they don't want to be there at that time, right? So they're like closing out on you. But zoos and aquariums, there's a lot of people that go willingly and happily, right? They're having a great time. So they're naturally very open to receiving all this type of information that you're giving them, or these experiences, right? And so if you find out together with your marketing department, or even if you do a lot of focus groups, or if you go out there, you talk to people and you find out what's missing, I think that you're going to have a very positive result. I really do, for sure. I mean,
Thanks, Valerie.
and yeah, I think it's going to work out. And and one of the things that you're doing positive already is that you already figured out that there's something that you're missing, right? That there's something that's missing and that you need to work on. And that's the hardest part, because if you don't notice it, you're never going to solve it. So I think that you've already done the hardest part, which is recognize that there's something that's wrong that you need to fix. So head on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Valerie.
Unfortunately for us as an association, the hardest part is convincing everybody else, yes, there's an issue. Sometimes it takes a lot longer to get everybody, you know, on the train. It's a challenge, but yeah.
And that
We will
you're
continue
absolutely
working
right,
on it.
Laura. Yeah, one of the reasons why this strategy exists is that we know that there is 180 something different countries, and they're all at different places. They have different business operating models, different cultures, different positions, different views of senior leaders. And so, you know, I would say that I would hope the strategy helps membership associations like EASA to be able to start having those conversations, to start shaping your conferences and your kind of the training work that you do as part of your role into having those kind of conversations. I saw Daja had a hand up. Did you still have a comment or question?
I have like a bunch of them. The problem is that you guys keep talking, and so I keep getting like new comments in my head, and when you keep talking, and I like miss the window of opportunity to ask my question. So now I'm like sitting here with a bunch of them, right? I'll try to speak quietly because it's almost midnight where I'm at. But I think I'm gonna pivot right back to my first question, which is that you were talking about where we're doing the education work, right? Inside the zoo or online or wherever. And this is actually a topic that I was talking about with one of my colleagues recently, because he went to the EASA conference and heard about all the different things that zoos are doing. And we were discussing the fact that it seems that other zoos do a lot more of outside work than our zoo does. And we were like discussing different reasons that it could be. We think it's because from the very beginning of our zoo, like just over 80 years ago, we were very education oriented. So right from the beginning, we had education department, and they were like from the first year doing a lot of stuff inside the zoo. So there's like a tradition there. But as we're like going to conferences and learning about all the things that other people are doing, we're getting like these ideas, right? And a little bit of fear of missing out, you know, like everyone is doing education work outside of the zoo. Like, should we also do it? And I don't know, like, should we?
And this is a great question. I'm going to say that some people are talking about doing work beyond the zoo grounds, and some, as you say, some people do it a lot and really well. I think the majority are either just starting or trying to figure out where they fit and what their purpose is. Because for like you, they've spent many years having educational programs where buses arrive and school kids get off and they have their programs on the zoo site. And so do you just take that out to a school and do it in their classrooms? Do you go on to like a field site and kind of have practical programs? And I think these are the questions that we want zoos and aquariums to have. There isn't really this is what you've got to do or this is what you should do, but it's acknowledging that, you know, are there some gaps in who you're connecting with and how you might be kind of delivering your conservation education. And one of those ways is out in the community beyond the zoo grounds. There's also online, there's also lots of different ways. So for you, it may not be that appropriate for your zoo. And I think it's interesting, it's good to hear different zoo and aquarium stories, but also understanding that, you know, it's not there's not just one path. There are many different roads to follow with conservation education. And this chapter is just making sure that we are aware, that we have that kind of wide lens to say what kind of things might you try and might you think about in terms of your conservation education opportunities. That's my perspective.
Yeah, I was
Valerie?
going to say that. Yeah, I was going to say that the strategy are things that you need to take into consideration, but it's never going to tell you how to do it. Because as Sarah said, there are so many different contexts around the world, and that there's a reason why chapters 1 and 2 are the first 2 chapters, you know, and it's because you need to be asking yourself, why am I doing this? And what's the main goal? And if going outside brings you closer to that goal, well, then do it, right? But that's something that only you know in that context, in that particular context that you are right now, right? And so it doesn't matter if someone else is doing it. They have their different reasons, different audiences, different needs, different goals, right? But you need to figure out for yourself, and you also need to sort of weigh, you know, what are your resources, because sometimes maybe an aquarium is right next to the beach, so it's easier for them to just go during high or peak season and do activities, right, with all the visitors. But maybe for you, it's very hard to get out there and do different educational activities, right? So those are all considerations that you need to be thinking about, and not just doing something because it's in fashion or whatever, right? It's something that you need to think about and realize if that particular activity or program that you're thinking of is going to take you to that main goal that you have for your program, right? So, and a lot of other considerations that I told you. So
absolutely. And just thinking on that, it's even like questioning and having slight disruption on like, what have you always done? And to go back to that kind of purpose, I remember talking to, I think we had this conversation in our last chapter about summer camps. Jessica, you're from a USU, and I know that there's lots of summer programs, summer camps, and the question was like, why do we do these? Why does everybody do them? Do we need to do them? And it is about kind of generating that revenue. But going back to Valerie's point, there is a notion of like questioning, saying, does that get us closer to our purpose? So one of the things I would do with this chapter is to really kind of think about the audiences, but also then think about the programs and the purpose that you have, and saying, are you connecting the purpose to your programs, and where are the gaps? And that could be where you do need to go beyond the zoo grounds or online or in different places and spaces within the city or the country. But there isn't, unfortunately, there isn't really easy way to give you that answer. We've got 5 minutes left, so did you have more questions? Anything that we might be able to help you out with?
Another like comment that I had was to something that Laura said. Laura, you mentioned that as a white person, you didn't feel that it was necessarily like your place to lead that. But I had a different thought, which was that if someone is a part of any kind of minority group, then actually to be the first one to push for the kind of change that is needed is a very vulnerable and emotional position to be in. And this is actually something that I see in my work. Because I actually belong to like a bunch of different minorities, and I don't necessarily want to advocate for all of them, because I'm afraid I might cry if I'm not taken seriously, like from the get-go. And so if it's someone else who starts the conversation, then it's much easier to join. I think about stuff like that from time to time, because like, even with different disabilities, right? Disabled people are not generally a very lucrative demographic. So it has to be from a sense of like a higher purpose and duty that you include them, and you have to really fight for them. And it's hard to do if it's your people,
Thank you.
Yeah,
And
I think it's finding that space between I'm being a good ally versus I'm trying to take over the conversation, and maybe that's also like my personal work that I need to do to kind of negotiate that better.
No, that as well. Totally, like you have to be really sure that you know what you're talking about, right? That you understood the situation correctly, and that the thing that you're asking other people to do is actually like that it's actually gonna help.
Yeah, and that goes back to that idea of what is our intention for the work that we're doing, but also sometimes the intention doesn't really match the impact. And so we can prepare and have thought about how we intend to, think about and support diverse communities, but how do we bring those kind of conversations to the right kind of progress? I mean, at Auckland Zoo, as I said, we're a multicultural city, bicultural country, and absolutely, you know, thinking about whose role is it to progress our bicultural journey at the organisation, and really is everybody's. It is not just our Kaupapa Māori advisor, it is not just our Māori staff, it is everybody's conversation to be had. We all play a part, and how do we bring our whole selves to those conversations? But I think you're right, it's a vulnerable space, it's an uncomfortable space, you know, and that's where, you know, to Laura's point, you know, certainly New Zealand has a huge colonial history, and we acknowledge that past, but we are trying to kind of prepare and step forward into the future. And that means that not only everybody in the organisation, but everybody in our country needs to have those conversations. I'm going to end on, you know, just some thoughts on inclusion, and really thinking about belonging, because that really, the stuff that we've just been talking about really kind of connects to that, because when we think about who belongs at the zoo, in our staff and our volunteers and our visitors, you know, it's a huge kind of task to say, how do we create spaces that are welcoming, that give a sense of belonging to everybody, that people feel that they can bring their whole self to work, the whole self to volunteering, the whole self to a visit, without having to try and fit in. And I think actually that's, you know, a big part of this chapter is, what is the role of conservation education in our kind of profession to say, how do we create those spaces and places and enabling environments and conversations that really allows a sense of belonging to different parts of our communities, that we can actually have really progressive zoos and aquariums. And I remember listening to talk where a few months ago where they said, well, you know, something we've got to be really clear of is, like, why on earth is zoos and aquariums interested in this? Why are we interested in diversity, equity, access and inclusion? We're in the game of like saving species. And, you know, the speaker said, well, you know, we need, conservation isn't going away. It's also, you know, there's what areas where it is kind of getting better and we are progressing, but there's a lot of challenges. And that's where we need more voices, more diverse voices, more kind of input into the conversation. And biodiversity is a whole planet problem, not just a few people. And so that's why it's incredibly important to me. What we'll do is we'll just end with Valerie, if you want to give a few comments about our conversation. Anything?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to you, that the reason why we care that we have a wide range of audiences and that we're very diverse is because we're all part of conservation, and conservation depends on all of us together doing something about it, right? It doesn't matter. I mean, conservation does not discriminate. We do, but conservation doesn't, right? Because we're all in it. We're all contributing or not contributing towards it, right? So it doesn't matter. And the last thing that I was gonna say to Darja, I don't know if I'm saying it right, I'm very sorry, is that, you know how as educators, when we have a program or an activity, we have to think about how we need to present like multifaceted reasons in order to get to like one particular goal. You know, like some people, when you tell them, oh, this animal is endangered, they do care, they truly care. And some other people don't care at all, right? And some people might care if that means that they're going to lose their job, or if that means that somehow it's going to be economically related, or they care if maybe their grandkids are going to be affected, or maybe, right, like there's just a lot of ways to get around a point to actually get to that specific goal that you have, right? It works exactly the same on an internal level in your institution, right? So like as an educator, sometimes when you need to tell your board or a superior why you have a particular interest in doing a program or activity that might be for a minority, you have to think about how you're going to go around that point and somehow getting to that goal that you have, because it might not be interested for them if it's not like economically feasible, or if it's not going to be or have like a huge impact or whatever. But it might be something else. It might be that you're saving them from legal action further on. Who knows, right? Or it might be because you have a specific interest, because there's a specific animal or species that you're trying to do research on, or that you're trying to educate people about. And maybe there's a certain population that's very important towards that goal, right? So there's a lot of ways that you can work that around in order to get what you're going after. So the same strategy that you apply when you're doing all your programs and education with your visitors, with your audience, you have to do the same thing on an inner level, with like in your institution. You have to work that out and be very strategic about it too. So that's my advice. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I've really enjoyed this conversation as always. Thank you so much for participating. We have our next session already set up. You can register. I'll just pop this in the chat. It's going to be chapter 4. It's on the either 30th of November, 1st of December, depending on your time zones, bit of a gap. But we will see you there for chapter 4. Thank you so much, Valerie. Appreciate your inputs. Thanks for getting up early, late, whichever time zone you're in, and have a great rest of your day. So thank you so much, and we'll see you again.